I'm looking good.
When it comes to the Ridge Racer franchise, most people believe that the franchise was exclusive to the PlayStation, and that is mostly true. I mean, there were 4 games in the franchise that were exclusive to that console: Ridge Racer, Revolution, Rage Racer, and Ridge Racer Type 4. These 4 games are pretty good in their own right. I mean, a while back I made a review of Ridge Racer Type 4, and you can see this video in the description below. However, what if I told you that there was a time that Ridge Racer appeared on the quote-unquote iconic Nintendo 64? That might be a weird thing to say, considering that Namco was always on the PlayStation side. After all, the PlayStation used CDs, which were easier and cheaper to make, not to mention that these little discs could hold up to 700 megabytes of data. Sadly, Nintendo decided to keep the cartridge stick for the next console, and sadly the choice of using cartridges as opposed to CDs were pretty much a death sentence for the console, as the writing was on the wall. Because of this, developers had a very tough time to implement FMVs or even high quality music on their games, since the cartridges had a very appalling limit of 64 megabytes of data. Don't get me wrong, games like Resident Evil 2 and Pokemon Puzzle League were capable of having FMVs, but they had a lot of compromises due to cartridge limits, which is why games like Ace Combat and Tekken weren't available on the Nintendo 64. But somehow Ridge Racer, of all things, made its way on the Nintendo 64. The game was named Ridge Racer 64 and it was released in 2000, at the beginning of the new century, and this time around it was developed by Nintendo Software Technology, who created some games from some Nintendo franchises like Pokemon Puzzle League, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, and F-Zero 99, which was released recently on the Switch. However, Namco did offer some help during the production of the game, so at least there's some Namco DNA scattered around the game here and there. Let's see if this installment of the franchise is just as good, or is it the black sheep of the classic era? Well, let's find out. Similar to other games in the franchise, Ridge Racer 64 has a Grand Prix timed attack at VS mode up to 4 players. Ridge Racer 64's Grand Prix progression is kinda similar to Rage Racer, as you need to complete a set of tracks in order to move on to the next championship. The Grand Prix has 8 stages, and if you complete a stage, you unlock a few set of cars. However, you cannot use them immediately, since in order to use them, you need to face them in this new mode called Car Attack, which is an interesting feature, kinda similar to the time trials from the first 2 Ridge Racer games, and facing these AI cars are not that difficult. Ridge Racer 64 has courses from the original Ridge Racer and Ridge Racer Revolution, but also has its own set of new courses named Ridge Racer Renegade, which are fictional tracks that take place in a desert land, which is pretty interesting. It's a shame that courses from Rage Racer or Type 4 didn't make an appearance. I mean, they could have at least bring back Rage Racer courses or some of the tracks from the 4th installment, but alas, because of the cartridge limitations, this didn't happen, and it kinda sucks that we never saw a Nintendo 64 incarnation of the Rage Racer tracks. I wonder what it could have liked if they were present in this game. As for the new tracks, they are pretty decent to drive around, and it's pretty unique. Sadly, these tracks never appear in the other iterations of the franchise, which is kind of a shame. The game also has another exclusive course known as Ridge Racer Extreme. If you have played Rage Racer or Type 4, you know exactly what I'm talking about. These games have some sort of an oval track that speed was the name of their game, and Ridge Racer Extreme is no exception to the rule, and it's a decent track and a quite good looking course at that. As for the car roster, Ridge Racer 64 has over 32 cars. The 12 original cars from the first 2 games do make a return, and they have received a major visual overhaul. Compared to their incarnations of the PS1 versions, I really do like the 64 versions of them. They give it a more distinct look. In Ridge Racer Revolution, some cars like the yellow Sovalu and blue Sovalu had the same car model with a different paint. Here, they somehow made them more distinct. For instance, the blue Soval resembles the Yasuluto Bisonte from Ridge Racer Type 4, and the pack racing car resembles the Tarazi Troupe from Type 4 as well. Some cars from that game do make a return as well, like the Assoluto Infinito, the Dig Racing Team Car, AG Supernova, and even the ferocious Lizard Nightmare. But there's also new cars as well that were never seen in other Ridge Racer games, like the Atomic Purple, Extreme Green, and even the Ultra 64 car, which appears in the cover art of the game and is the strongest car in the game. Fun fact about the car, but the name Ultra 64 is actually a prototype name for the Nintendo 64. You can see the prototype logo, for instance, in the arcade version of Cruisin' USA, given that the game was also going to be released on the console back in 1996.
Coming to your home in 1995, only on Nintendo Ultra 64.
I find it sort of baffling that they didn't name the console like that. They named their 60-bit console the Super NES. I think they should have called the N64 the Ultra 64 or even the Ultra NES. That would have been badass, but enough about that. Let's talk about the controls. The controls are pretty solid for a racing game on the Nintendo 64. Sure, it's not as perfect as in Type 4, but for what it is much more stable and snappy. Drifting around the corners were very satisfying to do, and I feel like Nintendo Software Technologies looked at the drifting mechanics of the first two games and said, you know what, we can do better. And they did. I feel like the drifting mechanics from 64 were much more polished than Ridge Racer and Ridge Racer Revolution, not to mention the sense of speed, especially in the later levels, just hits the right spot. As for the difficulty, Ridge Racer 64 is not that hard, but it's imperative to use later cars in the game since they are much more viable. Oh, when you complete the last two stages, you will unlock the Z-Class races, which are the hardest in the game. The AI will not hold back, it's pretty brutal, especially on tracks like Ridge Racer Novice and Ridge Racer Revolution Novice tracks. If you complete them, you'll earn the Platinum Trophy as well as the Ultra 64 car. It doesn't end there though. There are also bonus cars that are unlocked by meeting certain requirements, like hitting the helicopter at the beginning of the race, beating the Galaga 88 minigame, and setting a course record in a track. In addition, the game also offers a drifting and collision detection system, a new progressive system, a Ridge Racer Revolution system, and even the original Ridge Racer drifting and collision system for veterans. While Ridge Racer 64 lacks some vehicle customization features like creating decals, you can still change the color of your cars, which is pretty unique. Have you ever dreamed about having an FA Racing Team car blue or green? Well, you could do that in this game. For an N64 game, Ridge Racer 64 sure looks pretty good, but how does it stand compared to the other entries in the franchise? Well, it certainly looks better than the first two Ridge Racer games, and the difference of the quality between 64 and the first two Ridge Racer games is pretty huge. The old tracks feel much more refined, as if you're playing a faithful remake of the original Ridge Racer. Make no mistake though, the original Ridge Racer's graphics still looks decent, and it captures that PS1 feeling if you catch my drift. Now granted, it's not as pretty as Ridge Racer Type 4, that will never be outdone, but for an N64 game, it's actually really good. Not to mention that the game has no slowdowns whatsoever, so that's a huge plus, as most N64 games do suffer from a lot of slowdowns. The soundtrack of the game was composed by Keith Aram, who also composed soundtracks for a lot of games like Guilty Gear, Persona 5 Scramble, and even Persona 4. The soundtrack packs a lot of techno music, which isn't surprising because the first games also had techno music. The songs are pretty decent and catchy. Listen. Now, I still wish that the soundtrack had more variety, but for what it is, it's not that bad. Now, let's travel back in time, in 2004, the year where Nintendo released their new handheld, the Nintendo DS. You have a copy of Ridge Racer 64 on your old N64 and ask yourself, oh gee, I really wanted to bring the Ridge Racer experience on the go. Well, Ridge Racer DS has got you covered, my son. So this DS port of Ridge Racer 64 was released on December 7, 2004, 1 month after the launch of the Nintendo DS. And believe it or not, this was the version that I played as a kid. I didn't have an N64 in Portugal since it was too expensive compared to the cheaper PS1 back in the day. Not to mention that during summer, I always went to America for a summer vacation, and I knew that DS games were region free. This really made game collection more convenient, and I bought this game for only $5 back then, and it was really fun to play. Now granted, I bought the game back like in 2007, and at the time I also had the PSP with Ridge Racer, which was also a great game, but I really wanted to see if this game was also a good game, and it was. So what this port brings to the table? Well, it has all the content of the original Ridge Racer 64. All the cars, all the tracks. It's essentially Ridge Racer 64 on the go. But there were a few changes here and there. The handling system was tweaked a bit, so turns were easier to negotiate. Some balancing changes on the cars, the rear view mirror was sadly removed, which kinda sucks, which was useful for trying to block these opponents that were trying to overtake you. And since this is a DS game, it's pretty obvious that the game used touchscreen shenanigans, using the touchscreen to steer your car, which was a novelty back then, but nowadays it's pretty cumbersome and also pretty unresponsive. The game still lets you steer your car with a D-pad, it is not the worst thing ever. I can live with that, and I used to play it like that before I discovered that some emulators like DuckStation or Beetle PSX could emulate the Netcon controller. Some car designs have also been altered as well, with some cars having Nintendo characters like Mario, Peach, and Donkey Kong feature on their cars, which is so freaking Nintendo. Also, it's worth mentioning that Reiko Nagase isn't in this version anymore. Instead, Gina Cavalli from R Racing Evolution, which was a spin-off of Ridge Racer but uses real-life cars, and it appears on the cover of this version. So, is Ridge Racer 64 any good? Well, for an N64 game, it's actually really good. It's easily one of the best racers on the platform and brings some excellent arcade intense action, but as a Ridge Racer game, it's pretty decent. Sure, it doesn't have the highest highs of Ridge Racer Type 4, but for what it is, it's not that bad. Ridge Racer 64 feels like a remix or remake version of the first two Ridge Racer games, with a lot of quality of life improvements here and there, like new content, the controls, and the drifting mechanics were polished to greatness. The graphics, although not as perfect as Ridge Racer Type 4's graphics, they were still superb for the console, even outclassing the first two Ridge Racer games. It kinda sucks that the tracks from Ridge Racer and Type 4 were not included, but you know, it's not entirely the game's fault, it was the cartridge limitation that literally prevented that. But even so, Nintendo fans had a slice of the Ridge Racer cake and they ate it pretty well. Then the DS version was released 4 years later, and for the time it was pretty decent and interesting to bring the Ridge Racer experience on the go. But unfortunately, it was overshadowed by the more sophisticated PSP version of Ridge Racer. So you might be wondering, which version is worth playing, the N64 or the DS? Well, the answer might surprise you. While the DS version of Ridge Racer 64 is a decent way to play it, I feel like it's certainly not the best way. It lags analog support and the touchscreen features were kinda crappy for me. Not to mention that the N64 version had analog support. On top of that, I have a Steam Deck that can emulate this game perfectly, not to mention even your phone can play this game decently. So for me, I see no reason to play this DS version when there are better ways to play this underrated gem of a game. It was literally a product of its time and place. So overall, Ridge Racer 64 is an interesting underrated racing game that nobody in the Ridge Racer community, as far as I know, talks about it, and I think it needs some recognition. Sure, it's not as great as Type 4, but regardless, it's still a good game to have fun, and I recommend to any Ridge Racer or arcade racer fans to try it out.